welcome to another episode of Bones and Stones. Today we have Justin Bradfield joining us today, who is an associate professor from the Paleo Research Institute at the University of Johannesburg. Justin, it's great to have you back again. It's been a while. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but it's 5 years to the day that we spoke to you on our last, our last chat on Bones and Stones together, when we spoke about the bone arrowhead that you discovered at Classes. Yeah, so it's pretty much been a year. The year has just flown by. So obviously, thank you again for joining us today. And today's going to be a little bit of a different chat. We're not really going to be talking about your research per se, but we're going to be talking about an exciting conference that you're going to be busy organizing, that myself and Matt Caruana are also part of as the organizing committee. But maybe just to kick things off, Justin, if you could maybe talk us through what the conference is about, and obviously where it's going to be hosted, and then how did we get to this position? So how did you become the organizing secretary for this year's event?
Sure. Thanks, Matt and Matt. So we're talking about the Worked Bone Research Group Conference. It's a subsidiary organization, a working group essentially of the International Council of Archaeozoologists, or ICAZ for short. So ICAZ has numerous, I think it's in the region now of about 30 subgroups, working groups that also meet on a biennial basis. And the Worked Bone Research Group is one of those. And we focus on bone and other osseous artifacts that are found in archaeological records all over the world and through all time periods. And yeah, it's basically just a meeting of people who are interested in that aspect of archaeology to discuss theoretical and methodological approaches. So obviously each time period and each region of the world will have its own unique typologies. So we don't really focus too much on that. Or we usually focus on in the meetings is methodological and theoretical approaches to how do we actually use bone tools to answer broader questions about human behavior and humans in the past, and how do we go about looking at that. So that is what this meeting is also going to be about. The second part of your question, how did we get to this point? After being asked for the last 5 years by the previous liaison to ICAZ to host the conference, I have never been in a position to host the conference in South Africa, mainly because I didn't have a permanent position and I couldn't commit to doing something 2 or 3 years in advance where I didn't know where I would be. So once I was a little bit more settled job-wise at the University of Johannesburg, I then decided to make a pitch, which was at the last conference in 2019, and the group decided to have the next conference here in Johannesburg. So it's quite exciting. It's the first time that the conference will be hosted on the African continent, first time that it will be hosted in the Southern Hemisphere, and first time that University of Johannesburg or any South African institution is hosting a conference of this nature. So it's quite exciting in that regard.
Okay, yeah, I was actually going to say, what is going to be unique about the conference this time around? You've obviously alluded to some of those unique aspects now. So maybe just following on, you could talk about some of the challenges that you've had in terms of planning. Obviously, we all know that we're currently experiencing a global pandemic. Obviously, COVID has made international travel and events planning absolutely an absolute nightmare. So just talk us through that, Justin.
Yeah, so the planning started out easy enough. Once you get funding for a conference, the planning becomes that much more easy. And we were very lucky to have the Paleontological Scientific Trust come on board to fund the entire conference. And as you both know, we have waited as long as possible to see how the COVID pandemic would play out, to see if it would be possible to get people to Johannesburg in person to have a face-to-face meeting. And unfortunately, it hasn't been possible, just simply due to the fluid situation at the moment and the fact that there are so many countries now that are spiking with the third wave, fourth wave, So we felt that it would be more appropriate just to take the conference online so that everyone can then join, and we don't have any last minute cancellation, because literally, as you know, in this country, we don't know from 1 week to the next what our lockdown level is going to be and what the actual restrictions are going to be. So yeah, we've now moved the conference online, and I think it's the best decision that we could have made. It does allow us to have everyone here, so we don't have any travel restrictions imposed on anyone. And also we are able now, which is another unique feature of this particular conference, to open it up to other people who are not necessarily speaking at the conference, but who want to attend and listen into the conference as well, which previously hasn't been possible, because if you're not presenting at a conference, generally you can't get funding to attend a conference unless it's in your home country. So the registration is now opened, and we've got, I think, 59 people registered so far, which includes accepted speakers as well as people that are just interested in listening to some of the presentations. And it's literally from all over the world, which is really great. I mean, we've got people from the USA, from Australia, from China, many of the European countries, and in South Africa and Mozambique as well. And that's actually one of the great things about this conference, because historically, since the first conference was held in 1997, there have been very, very few African and Africanist scholars that have been represented at this conference. It's been very much European focused, and now in recent years, of course, also going to North America and China as well. But there's been very little representation of African and Africanist scholars there. So having it here in Johannesburg, or I say here, but I mean virtually, does allow a greater number of African scholars to join in, because usually, you know, the prohibitive travel costs going to Europe are unaffordable. So, I mean, that's one of the benefits of having it online, albeit one cannot have the face-to-face interaction that one would ordinarily like to have in a conference of this nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, face-to-face conferences are a lot of fun. You also get to, just interact with one another, after the sessions and stuff. Sometimes those informal chats and get-togethers afterwards are really where a lot of research ideas and, but I'm glad you touched on the kind of international aspect of the conference, because, just having looked at the program and gone through all the list of talks, I mean, it's incredible. It's literally like nearly every continent on earth is represented by presenters in this conference, which is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. 23 countries, 41 speakers, and I think close to 50 institutions are represented.
No, it's
which is fantastic. It also then, of course, speaks to the challenge, because having this thing online now means that we need to try and cater for the different time zones. So I need to cater for people in the Americas, as well as people in Australia, Japan, and the China zone, while still being in a suitable time zone for people in Europe and Africa, which is where the majority of the speakers are coming from. So that's proved to be a bit of a challenge, but looking at the different time zones, I think we've managed to schedule the different sessions in that very narrow gap that is suitable across all three time zones, or at least broadly suitable. Which also, of course, brings us to how we organize the sessions. Usually one would organize sessions according to some sort of theme, as you know, and now it's become, I mentioned to some of my other colleagues that it becomes a bit of a segregationist theme, because we are now lumping all the Americans together in one session and all the Australians together in another session, all the Europeans together in another session. So it seems very segregationist, but we've done that in order to try and be as accommodative as possible of people in their specific time zone, so that someone's not presenting at 10 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock in the morning or something. So we've had to do it that way.
I'm glad you touched on that, yeah, because I was actually going to ask you about how the program was compiled, and it was for those exact reasons. But then for people who, let's say, a session within that week that is, maybe late at night, that those sessions are going to be recorded, so people in other countries can then go back and then watch those sessions, say, the next day.
Yes, our plan is to record all the sessions, with the exception of the openings, well, at least part of the opening session, and that is because there is something there that is copyrighted, so we're not allowed to record that and put it out. But the rest of the sessions will be recorded, and then they will be made available on the conference website.
Okay, perfect. I was just going to ask you another question about the registration, but before I do that, let me just hand over to Matt Rowan. He's got a question for you.
Yeah, Justin, I was just wondering if you might be able to speak very quickly for those that might be interested in attending the conference, or maybe trying to catch some of these talks online afterwards. What the sort of details behind osseous technologies. Obviously, Africa has a sort of long sort of history of use of osseous technologies, and I was wondering if you might just be able to touch on quickly about maybe some of the similarities about how osseous technologies are used across time periods, across continents, and are there any sort of aspects of osseous technologies in Africa that are very unique when compared to other parts of the world?
Yes, thanks for that. I think the most unique aspect of osseous technology in Africa is that we have the oldest bone tool technology anywhere in the world. We have bone tools in South Africa dating from the early Stone Age. From about 2 million years ago, we start finding in East Africa hand axe replicas, bone, elephant bone, rhinoceros bone, whatever, that has been napped in exactly the same way that you would nap a stone tool, and they have been fashioned into essentially hand axes, what we would associate as a hand axe. Similarly, in South Africa, we have, at a similar time period, bone tools that we think were used for digging in the ground, usually to extract termites or tubers from the ground. A very different type of bone tool, but comparably old. So that is the oldest technology anywhere in the world. And I often have a fight with some of my stone tool colleagues because, looking at stone tools to get information about the archaeological record, I usually compare to looking at nappies. If you go to and no offense or anything, but if you go to a dump, a landfill site, if you think of all the material that is put into a landfill site that can tell us about human culture today, most of it's going to biodegrade. But what we're going to be left with in 1,000 years' time is the stuff that doesn't biodegrade. Your disposable nappies being probably the most prolific item that is in these landfill sites. So it's very, very nice in South Africa that we get bone tools at such an early stage, because it really shows us that people, right from the earliest times, when they first started making technology, were using bone as well as stone to create their artifacts. So yeah, and we've got a continuous record of bone tool technology. We even have people using bone tools up into the 20th century. So it's one of the most continuous and longest lasting records of osseous technology anywhere in the world. And that makes the African record quite unique in that regard. And you'll know that once better materials became available, such as metal, glass, and that kind of thing, stone was immediately abandoned in favor of those materials, whereas bone continued. Bone and ivory and horn, and in Europe, antler as well, continued right up until the 20th century. And in certain parts of Europe, even today, in very remote parts, people are still making bone tools and antler tools. So,
Jeez, okay, no, that's incredible, Justin. And
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, obviously the list of talks is really impressive. The list of presenters, it seems like there really is going to be a wider array of research presented. Given that that's the case, I presume obviously there's going to be quite a large international audience. So just coming back to the question I wanted to ask about the registration, how does one register for the conference, and is there a limit to the number of people that can attend a session? I mean, do people need to kind of rush out there and register as soon as possible to make sure that there is a space for you, or how exactly does it work?
Yeah, so you can register by following the link on the conference website, which is www.uj.ac.za/WBRG. And that will take you to the conference website, and there will be a link to the registration form on that website. Theoretically, we don't have a limit to the number of people who can attend, but in practice, our Zoom room can accommodate 100 people. So obviously, once I see we start getting close to that 100 people mark, we're going to then have to start deciding or prioritizing certain people, and then it will be on a first come, first served basis. But at the moment, there is still plenty of space. There's about 40 spaces left. So yeah, people are welcome right up until the end of July to click on the conference website and to register to join. And you don't have to join for the entire 5-day conference. It can be for just one of the sessions or 2 of the sessions. You can choose which sessions you want to do, because obviously they're spaced at different times to accommodate, whoever's speaking in that time slot. And then something else I should also mention is that the conference sessions, they are about 3 hours long each. And that's simply because we've had to, we've had to move this online. And so rather than expecting people to sit in front of their computer for a full day, which is what we would have done if it was a face-to-face conference, it would have run throughout the day. We've now decided to space that out rather over 5 days and have smaller, manageable sessions. So 3 hours is not too bad for people to participate in a session online.
Perfect. Yeah. Sorry, I suppose one thing we should also mention to the viewers are the actual dates for the conference. We haven't said that yet. So the conference is from the 30th of August to the 3rd of September. So it's going to be
that's right. Yes.
week, and obviously the preliminary program is uploaded on the UJ website that Justin just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
If you go across to that URL, the Google registration link is there, and then also obviously the preliminary program. So you can go through the program, have a look at which presentations you would be interested in attending, and then you can obviously then register for those specific sessions. But Justin, could you maybe just talk us through? Okay, look, we spoke a little bit about the challenges about moving the meeting from traditional face-to-face conference to now an online virtual conference. You mentioned obviously attaining conference funding is obviously one step in the right direction in terms of making an event happen. But could you maybe talk us through your kind of interactions with past and how you kind of navigated the issue? Because obviously having a face-to-face conference, you've got a lot of additional overheads that you don't have with an online conference. So how do you kind of navigate that with your funding body? Because obviously when you submit a funding application to host a conference, you've got to submit a budget, and you've got various items that are listed, and obviously that all changes with an online meeting. So maybe if you could talk us through that process.
Yeah, quite a long-winded and interesting process, and I think we've been extremely fortunate in our partnership with PAST. So initially, when we got when we won the bid to host the conference, I immediately started approaching various organizations and various bodies for funding, because obviously I got a quote from previous conference organizers about how much we would look to budget for, and I also looked at some of the venue hires, the catering, and once you have an idea of exactly how you want the conference to go and what you want to do in the conference and where you want to go for your post-conference and mid-conference excursions, it becomes a lot easier then to budget and to apply for specific amounts. The problem with most of the funders, at least your big funders, such as the National Research Foundation, is the deadline to apply for funding is far too close to the actual conference date, which creates a heck of a lot of anxiety, because you're never sure whether you are going to get that funding. and you can only apply for it in the year that the conference is going to take place. And for me, that is cutting it far too close and far too fine. And I don't think my nerves could handle that. So I approached a bunch of other people for little bits and pieces of funding as well. And one of the organizations I approached was, as I mentioned, the Paleontological Scientific Trust, or PAST. And I approached them initially specifically to make use of one of their public outreach programs for the opening session, which, as both of you will know, but as some of the audience won't, they run several campaigns, actual live theatrical performance campaigns to create public outreach and public awareness of paleontology, of paleoscience, and broad issues that affect society today, and how paleoscience can speak to some of those social issues. And I've seen I've seen both of their stage productions, and they're both very good. And I initially went there to ask whether we could borrow one of those stage productions and put it on for the opening session. And quite to my surprise, the CEO of PAST offered to sponsor the entire conference. And when I say the entire conference, I do mean the entire conference, as in sponsor registration fees, catering, venue hire, post-conference excursion, mid-conference excursion, and final dinner.
Wow.
The whole lot, which is very unique for a conference. I don't think I've ever been to a conference where everything has been sponsored, where literally the only expense I would have to fork out as an attendee is my airfare and accommodation. So that was a huge help for planning the conference, because once you have that funding and once you are certain that you can actually afford now to do the venue hire, do the catering that you want, the planning becomes a heck of a lot easier. Obviously now, since we've had to go online, as you mentioned, the funding requirements have dropped away considerably. But PAST has been very generous in the fact that they have allowed us to keep the funding. So the funding has now been converted into bursaries for students to do worked bone research projects, either at honors, masters, or PhD level at the University of Johannesburg. So we very shortly will be advertising for positions, fully funded positions for those topics. And also they've allowed us to do some conference prizes. So we are now going to be able to award, I think, at least 2 conference prizes for best student presentation and best overall presentation. And the prize money is quite generous, I think. So yeah, I mean, we've been very fortunate to partner with PAST, and I think PAST has a very active interest in promoting all forms of paleoscience in Africa and in South Africa. And, you know, this conference, it's the first time that it's ever been on the continent, first time in the Southern Hemisphere. So it is a historic conference in that regard, and it does provide a tremendous amount of exposure to African and Africanist scholars who are working in the field of work bone technology. And something else I should have mentioned a little bit earlier on, we obviously now have the highest number of African presenters at this conference. Usually in the last 5 conferences, it's been me, and that was it, the only representative from Africa. So now we've got, I think, about 6 or 7 people representing Africa, as well as an additional 2 Africanist scholars, one from the United States and one from Australia, who will also be speaking to various aspects of bone tool technology in Africa. So I think that is a very big plus for this conference.
Okay, no, great, Justin. Well, thanks very much. I think we're coming up on time now before we get kicked off Zoom. Presumably you will not have these timing issues when the conference is hosted on. It is going to be on Zoom, or is it Microsoft Teams? Zoom?
No, it's going to be on Zoom, yes. And no, we shouldn't have any timing problems because we are on the UJ account. So we can theoretically go for an 8-hour session if needed.
Okay, great. Well, Justin, yeah, thanks again for joining us. We're really looking forward to the conference, obviously.
My pleasure.
I've gone through the program myself and just put little ticks next to the talks that I don't want to miss. So yeah, really looking forward to it. Thanks for talking.
What's really nice about this kind of conference, just to quickly jump in, is the variety of talks. You know, usually when we go to the ASAPA conferences, we are very much inundated with Africanist talks, and you know, pretty much any talk you go to, you are vaguely familiar with the background of the topic that they're talking about. Whereas at this kind of conference, you're going to listen to talks about Viking period bone combs, about Roman period necklace clasps, you know, things that you just never get exposed to at ASAPA or generally at South African universities. So for me, that is one of the draw cards for these international conferences, is the sheer variety of topics that people speak on.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of those talks are actually ticked because it's just something that you don't get exposed to, and it'll be so nice to learn about something completely new and completely different. So yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Justin. Yeah, thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to obviously the upcoming conference.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, thank you both. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Justin.